Hey, Stu, I recently added Stormcrow to my Powered Vintage Cube. Do you think it'll be all right?
I think it's about time. I think we haven't made Stormcrow great again like we should. I feel we have a responsibility to probably the greatest and most powerful card in all of Magic. And I think this is an opportunity for all other Power Cube curators to follow what is undoubtedly a powerful and brave position that you have put yourself in and keep bucking that trend.
I mean, it is evasive, it is a flyer, and it is blue. And I think it really just pushes through the tempo. That's what we needed.
I agree. I think blue has always needed a bit of extra strength in its ability to close games out and gain the advantage. You know, blue has always struggled in that way, right? Either be it cards or bouncer, but they don't win. You don't win the games by just drawing cards. You've got to win somehow. And what better way to do it than with a 1/1 Stormcrow?
Stormcrow's going on the watch list immediately, though. Welcome to UberCube, the podcast we discuss all things Stormcrow, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka Uberbear, and today I am joined by my Power Cube savant.
Power Cube Savant. Hey, this is Stu, and I like that, but whether it's true or not is probably Power Cube maybe complainer.
Yes.
Can I call myself a complainer?
You point out this card is not good enough. That's kind of your MO.
I do that.
Yeah.
But I like to think my points are valid for the most part.
You're kind of like the second half. You're the problem, and then the solution comes at some point once I solve it, and you go, yeah, that seems good enough.
So I'm going to be the Vintage Cube Debbie Downer.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll put myself out there.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of we're going to call them the November-ish winter updates that I have done to my Powered Vintage Cube and what has worked and what has not worked, and basically try to give some insight into what playtesting has revealed, either be from the CubeCon, LobbyCon to present day. Also, it's pretty important. It's my birthday, so we're going to make this short.
Happy birthday to
November the 15th, which is super
birthday.
dated. Yeah, I know,
Happy
right?
birthday,
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy birthday to you too, sir.
Thank you.
All right, well, Stu has given me a gift, and it is an Allagash chocolate orange porter, and it is actually hella delicious.
It's very good. I would recommend that thoroughly. It's a nice, dark porter. It's beautiful.
I'd make you a cracking sound, but I already cracked it. What you got?
I'm keeping it simple right now, given it's been a crazy last couple of days. I'm just going to have a glass of wine, and then we are planning on going out and celebrating for Anthony's birthday this evening. We're taking the whole crew out, so I'm going to save myself a little bit for later on.
Same.
But a nice glass of wine never hurts.
So let's get to it. Let's kind of talk about some of the changes and the whys. And we're going to what we're looking at is Uberbear's Powered 540 Cube.
And specifically, these are going to be changes that have been made in the last 1 month.
Yep.
Just a month, so we're not going back super far. Obviously, you can go and check out Anthony's blog and all of his updates on Cube Cobra if you're interested in seeing what his Powered Vintage Cube looks like compared to other Power Vintage Cubes. There's been a lot of change recently. Yours is definitely reflecting of a lot of other vintage cubes that I've looked at, either the Moto Vintage Cube or personal vintage cubes. A lot of shifts. And tell me whether or not you think this is a fair statement, correct statement. This seems to me like we've been going through this period where months and months ago, even years ago, you could argue that there was a massive shift in the vintage cube, and it was all down to power creep, power level, right? Your Ragavans are coming in, your Minsk and Boos, even more recently, your Athari, stuff like that, right? So obviously those cards are very aggressive for the most part. A lot of very low cost, very efficient, aggressive cards that have come out recently. But this seems to be a little bit of a period right now where it seems that just the overall vibe and the fun factor is kind of taking a little bit more precedent when it comes to how vintage cubes are being tuned than it did in the past. I want to know if you agree with
I would agree with that. I would even lean towards say Daybreak Games being recent visible pioneers in this idea,
sure,
where they're adding cards in that they look jank on paper, but they are a Power Vintage Cube only because we get to see cool people like LSV and all that show us the power of cards that we wouldn't have normally seen. They may have been from a Commander Precon, or they were some obscure card from, and what kind of Duskmoor-ish Foundations is what we're kind of talking about today. And it's the obscurity of some of these cards that you wouldn't think about it. So that's one portion of it. Another unique identifier of my cube, I don't track. Let me step it back. When you look at the MTGO, and I hear a lot of people, there's kind of these two factions, and I'm on both sides of this. People who love Vintage Cube and those people who love the thematic specialty custom builds, right? All those type of cubes. And there's this interesting, like, dichotomy you see between these two. Well, because I lie between these two different worlds, I sometimes have to look at my cube through fun goggles a little bit more, and I don't go for optimization as much as possible. Also, I'm also running adjacent to our good friend Samich, who has a 450 power vintage cube, which is in fact a tighter list. And I'm all about repping that JP 540, right? So I am also trying to have some difference in how the two environments feel. And there's a challenge in that, right? When you're looking at, if you're going to take the creme de la creme, the upper echelon of cards, and that's how you're going to define a powered vintage cube once you've made that statement, you'll find it more difficult to tamper things back, right? You have to find a way to kind of disguise that as a curator. Like, what I mean by that is, I have a landfall package, and in the Wayback Machine, I may have had Gitrog in there, and Gitrog is a fine creature, but it also didn't feel like it met the power requirements against the other very optimized decks.
Absolutely.
Right? Mm-hmm. And also, to do something to distinguish myself a little different, I don't follow necessarily the recent current trends, and we're going to talk about some of that. I don't do things just because Moto's doing it. I don't do things just because Chris is doing it, which we openly communicate so that there's variance between our two environments so they don't feel samey. That's important.
It is. And I will say that that's very, very nice from a player perspective, that it's not just, do you want to draft the power cube? If we're all together, now we have options for multiple different power cubes, and they play. It's incredible how, yes, there's a lot of differences between them, but there's also a lot of similarities between them, but they just play so very differently.
Right. The core is still going to look
the same. Your
right?
ancestral recalls,
it's very hard
Moxen,
to break away
Lotus,
from that. But maybe I'm doing more of a Lands Matters, and I know he's not. I shift more towards a really artifact-centric, and he does as well, but a lot less. And we're going to kind of hear some of that as we talk about. So some of these choices are driven by those kind of multifaceted ideas. I don't want to be following the latest trends as much as possible. I don't want my cube to look samey to Chris's, right? That's all important to me, while I'm also trying to ensure that Stu says this card is not good enough for a vintage cube. So you can see the pressure, the boil over here.
Look, I haven't been saying that as much recently.
You've gotten better.
Well, I think maybe you could argue that when we very first started having these talks, right, even before we started doing this podcast, and maybe the reason why we started doing this podcast is because we would sit on my back porch, drinking a beer and talking about, new sets that had come out, or just looking at the list and me saying, right, that, yep, get rid of those, that, get rid of those, or you've got to put this card in. So it's just, I think you've refined not just as a power cube curator, but
I also stopped listening to Stu.
You're a better curator. It's your birthday, so I'm going to give you a break today. But that I'm sure that even just looking at all of your other cubes as well, right? It's like any skill, you work on it long enough, you're going to get better and better at it. 10,000 hours maybe. So now you're in a position, and plus I don't want to say that it's become more defined as far as like the overall capability of what a vintage cube can do, or all the archetypes are necessarily predefined, so you can just go onto the internet, and if you wanted to do that and just copy the vintage cube, that's fine. But there's so much room right now for creativity with the vintage cube, again demonstrated by the fact that we've got two so very different ones in our group.
I would agree with that 100%. Another motivational factor for why this cube is changing this period is because our good friend Sam had definitely noticed that my aggro package had been definitely decimated at one point. And so I'm going to give a little bit of cause and effect to this. If we pay attention to our previous episodes, and I'm gonna point at Stu a little bit here. He's going to have to take a little bit of this one.
I'm doing
He'll
it.
say, this card's not good enough. And I found myself, I guess, succumbing to the peer pressure and putting in a card that was better. And what became of my cube is my Boros aggro, if we'll call it that, the blend of the two, whatever you want to call, really started to crank up around 3, where it really needed to be getting on the ground by 1. And one thing that Sam really enlightened me to this idea, and I don't know how I didn't notice it, because a lot of times 1-drops, frankly, can be slightly boring.
Yes.
I mean, we're just going to call them what they are, right?
Yeah.
They can be boring in comparison to the gameplay for what they do. And you and I have talked about this explicitly. We're both not aggro players. I'm not an aggro, but I also need to make sure that I provide that type of play style for the people who want it and to challenge the mechanical decks, the combo decks, etc. Right?
Maybe. So
I don't maybe that one.
I know this is not necessarily on topic for the purpose of this discussion, and maybe this is something that is just, well, it's definitely something that's just outside of the Vintage Cube discussion. But you have mentioned aggro as kind of being the police.
I would call it, I wouldn't call it police. I'd call it a ballast point.
The ballast point. Okay.
Yeah.
So and would you also say that, let's say if you've got a traditional archetype cube where you've got your combo decks, you've got your mid-range decks, you've got your aggro decks, all that kind of stuff, right? Where are you balancing the rest of the cube? Do you balance the rest of the cube and then balance aggro to go with it? Or do you look at the aggro package and then balance because I kind of feel that balancing aggro around the rest of the cube kind of makes the most sense to me, right?
Yes, aggro is the checkpoint. Everything else just falls into place to a degree naturally. I mean, a lot of these decks are very well advertised and play tested by, like we talked about. We mentioned like LSV and other content creators we watch, right? Caleb Gannon, etc. And we can see, we already know how the cause and effect of certain relationships of cards occur. They're not a mystery. Like, I kind of alluded to the idea of Kiki Twin. Kiki Twin's still in my cube. People will say Kiki Twin's not good enough anymore.
I am always happy to see.
Kiki Twin is 100% good enough because when we were doing LobbyCon at CubeCon recently, someone pulled off Kiki Twin. They didn't 3-0 with Kiki Twin, but what they got to say was, oh, cool, I just did Kiki Twin. That's part of the curation philosophy. Running a powered vintage cube, you can actually find yourself succumbing to the pressure, of the populace telling you what belongs in that cube. Meanwhile, you need to realize that cube is your cube and belongs to your play group. And sometimes that's a hard little thing to balance.
I don't disagree. I think where I would kind of aim that, if there was ever criticism about it, right? I like the Kiki Jiki-esque combos, right? So it's Kiki Jiki with an enabler, it's Splinter Twin with an enabler, whatever that card might be. And there's, I don't know, you could maybe say 4 or 5 cards. You definitely need to include one card for each of Kiki Jiki and Splinter Twin. Obviously, they don't work together. But you need to have at least one that work with both. And then maybe a bit of redundancy. Because I feel like you can put them just organically in a deck that shares colors as an example and just kind of think, okay, if I draw them both, then perfect, I've got a combo in. If not, I've got the rest of the deck that, has a plan as well. But they do kind of stay fairly isolated in the Vintage Cube.
The components,
but I don't mind that.
The components of them, I'm at 540, so 540 creates its own problems.
Absolutely.
Right? It creates its own problems with just the probability of actually getting the cards that you require to complete any subset, right? I run into problems with Storm, right? I run cards like Metamorphose, and we're not going to go off on this whole tangent.
Sure.
But I run cards that maybe aren't so great for Storm because I need to give more components because I have a wider breadth of a cube. Mm-hmm. And I'm all about that diversity. Gavin just recently talked about that, where he likes sometimes the mystery of what still lies within the box when you haven't drafted the entire cube. That is going to happen in my cube.
Yes.
And so you may not complete all the subsets, but something like, and we went tangentially on Kiki Jiki because it's something that has been benchmarked again as just kind of fallen to the wayside, or that package has been removed, or that statement's been made to me. It still has a utilitarian purpose. I've seen people do stuff with the card Kiki Jiki. Mono red, they just do something different. They launch a goblin at you that you weren't expecting. It may not fit that criteria of completing that combo, but players will find their own way. And
players, I like it. I don't mind taking a Kiki Jiki. I know it's an expensive card, and that can be a dangerous thing to do, is to spend 4, 5, 6. I would even go, I know that Kiki Jiki is 5, but even at 4 mana, you got to be careful on playing something that isn't very much impactful on that first turn. But Kiki Jiki by itself can be quite impactful,
I've seen it launch a Grizzlebrand, man.
What about a Glory Bringer?
Just something goofy that you weren't expecting, like, oh, well, I guess I'm getting hit by 7 damage, and they're drawing 7 cards, and yes, it dies in a turn due to the legendary rule. You see this goofy...
It dies immediately.
Yeah, but you see that goofy
You can't launch it. It dies immediately. Copying a Glory Bringer, copying a Bonehorde Dracosaur, copying any one of those. There's so many 4 and 5.
Time out. It doesn't die immediately. The original one dies. The new one stays on the ground. You now have a new copy of it.
If it's Gristlebrand...
Yes.
Gristlebrand is legendary. If you copy Gristlebrand, legendary effects immediately.
You choose which one you want to kill, though.
Correct. Right.
So you choose the one that doesn't have summoning sickness. You launch in with the one that's now fresh and can run, has haste.
But you're talking about casting Gristlebrand, creating a copy. So you've got to cast Gristlebrand before. So you've already got Kiki-Jiki, cast Gristlebrand, copy immediately, sacking the original, keeping the token,
strike,
and then swinging
and
with
then you can do reanimation nonsense. Now this makes more sense.
Yeah, all right.
It's silly, but you see what I'm doing.
Right. Leave all that in. Leave all that in.
I will.
That was neat. Okay, so yes, you're absolutely right. But I was not thinking in the same path that you were thinking. But yeah, absolutely. Copy a Gristlebrand. Copy any legendary creature that's big and powerful. Copy a Torsten. Copy, again, even something more simple like a simple 4/5 mana creature.
So we can see, like, with the current where we're at right now, Foundations, and we recently had Duskmourn as well, and we have other sets coming out soon. I don't know, what are we calling it next year? We're calling it some kind of like Cyberdrive, something or other. But you can see where cards are always going to fall in that realm. It's simply not good enough anymore because the power creep, whether we like it, love it, or leave it, continues to march forward, and you have to make a decision of where you want your cube at. You can't that's always been the push and pull of running a power vintage cube, is the expectation of the masses, right? When you present said cube and you're saying the power 9 is there's all this like baggage that is attached to that idea. Also from what the player expectation is, but in addition to, like, when I said people were like, oh, that's not my type of cube, that's not my type of vibe, I don't enjoy that, etc. I get it, I respect it, but you can make them unique, and I've been working on doing that this winter.
I think that's great. And look, I will still remember the time where you told me that you couldn't take Tarmogoyf out of your cube because people just expected to see it, and now it's like a dinosaur. And you could have argued that it had overstayed its welcome even back then, but definitely now, I mean, I still think Tarmogoyf is maybe a little underpowered, but I'm never going to complain to see.
Well, you've already declared war, so he's skipping ahead. We don't have any notes, so we're just free-forming this like nobody's business. But that is funny. That brings up a pressure point that's happened recently. Sure. The Moto featured the Tarmogoyf package, and there were 4 of them, and I don't know, like, it was Pyrogoyf and Burrogoyf,
yeah,
some other Goyfing, a lot of Goyfs.
Pyrogoyf and Barrogoyf, definitely the creme de la creme of the new iteration of Lurgoyf creatures. But yeah, absolutely, there is this new cycle.
And Gast, I didn't run any of them. I chose not to. Chris is running that grouping, that 4 grouping.
He's running all of them.
I chose to go, and he's like, they're amazing. You should add them. And I mean, that's just him being, providing information on what works in his cube. And I found myself kind of like feeling that internal peer pressure, right, from all you guys. Oh, especially Pyrogoyf. I think Pyrogoyf is the one that got lit up the most. Everybody's like, you need to add that Pyrogoyf now. But I haven't seen the necessity for Pyrogoyf, and I have solutions for that. I've moved different directions, and we're going to talk about that.
Let's first also, I think this needs to be stated, there's going to be updates in the Vintage Cube on Magic Online that maybe don't align with paper curators. You can also understand from Wizards of the Coast and maybe Daybreak, I'm sure that there's some correlation between the two, that they are going to want to showcase new and powerful cards in the Vintage Cube. If for no other reason other than for testing, right? Let's see how this works. What kind of interactions, what kind of synergies can we find? So I think that that's an important differentiator between that Magic Online cube and yourself or Samich or anyone else with a vintage cube out there. And again, kind of highlights, if you don't want to include it, you don't even have to provide a reason. If you just don't want to put it in, then don't put it in.
So we're going to go back in time here a little bit. We're going back to early October.
Get your DeLoreans.
And I knew that we're going to have all these people hanging out in the Home 2 Suites lobby where Stu decided not to show up this year to play some Powered Vintage Cube.
That's
and that'd be our good friend Chill and Shoop and Kirby and Chris and Christian, and the list goes on. And it's kind of something we've done, I guess, as a tradition. We play that in the Two-Headed Giant Cube. And I always want to bring in new cards because, you know, people like Chill, Shoop, Kirby, etc., they're outside of our play group and they have a lot of opinions, and I wanted to see cards in action that were a little different than I was running, and then having that mindset of, I knew there was a few overarching things that I wanted to do to my environment. One, I wanted to add the Surveil lands. Like, that is quite possibly my personal favorite land out of any of them.
No brainer. Beautiful.
Like, they're gorgeous.
Yeah.
They're just elegant. They're sleek. They do exactly what I want them to do, even down to like the parlor for Boros. So I wanted to get those added in. So I added at least 8 of the 10. I'm still working on that. They're expensive now. But I also wanted to kind of do what Sam had been telling me on a previous playtesting, that my aggro package was less than at that point because of the diversity of being at 540. So I wanted to add a few cards. And Duskmorn gave me a little cool treat, and it was with Norin the Swift Norin Swift Survivalist. For 1 red, you get a 2/1 legendary creature, Human Coward. I mean, just spoke to me right there, right? Norin Swift Survivor can't block. Whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may exile it. You may play that card from exile this turn for 1/1. You can see where, like, you're attacking in with your aggro creatures, they get chump blocked by your mid-range deck, you get to pull them out. You can try to find another avenue. I know that's not ideal, but you can find an opportunity to solve that problem. You don't have time. You're not just losing soldiers for the sake of losing soldiers. Would you agree with that? This is a neat little card. This is one of the first ones that came out recently.
That is an interesting mechanic. I will say that you can just replay your creatures.
You can do some silly ETB stuff post.
You can, absolutely. Obviously, there's the condition that you have to actually cast them. So it is a mana cast, and it is 1 mana, and it is a 2/1. So it's a little on the fragile side. I'm including this for the fun factor alone. Like, what can I see this? Immediately, I'm thinking, how can I abuse this? What kind of, consistent advantage can I get from something like this? Like, why wouldn't you want something like this in your cube if for no other reason, just to test your players? Like, all right, guys, this is what I've got in there. What can you do with it? And I don't know. I'm putting a prize if it's me. Like, person who makes the coolest Norrin deck in the first month gets a sandwich.
Yeah, I haven't got to see the sandwich. Yeah, sure. Sandwiches for everyone.
$5 Subway.
Yeah.
Yeah,
not even real tuna.
No.
But we don't even know, like, I actually don't know what the interactions are with this because it screams aggro, but there is an opportunity to do some unusual things with this. I don't know. You're crashing in with your already spent, let's say, Ewit. And they have an option to choose now. And they're going to choose to take the 2/1 because they don't want you to crash in, get the Ewit back to hand, and be able to play that Ewit. So it kind of creates like that weird little tension. I can see some of that.
Yeah, I'm going to be fearful every time that you're crashing in because I know that you've now got that opportunity to create real value, repeated value. And like you say, I really don't think it would be super difficult to build something around this card. I really don't.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about something else. This is a little bit of a later dated card, and what we're seeing is a little bit of in and a little bit of out. So one of the cards that I actually really enjoyed very much was Oblivion Ring, but I think that card had kind of, based on where I'm at in my 540, had kind of seen better days. And I wanted to also increase that kind of that aggro push. And this is kind of a mid-rangey aggro push we're going to talk about here, but I think it's an interesting card. Do you want to tell them about this card?
So this is Toby Beastie Befriender. This is 2 and a white for a legendary creature, human wizard. It's a 1/1. Whenever Toby Beastie Befriender enters, creates a 4/4 white beast creature token with this creature can't attack or block alone. And it also has, as long as you control 4 or more creature tokens you control have flying.
It gives all your spirits from Lingering Souls flying?
I should hope that there would be some redundancy there.
Flying.
Maybe if it said put counters on them on your upkeep or at combat.
What I like about a card like this is, aside from just kind of, it's a raw stats card, right? It's a 4/4 and a 1/1 for 3, so you're getting distribution. But what I like about a card like this is it represents future builds. It doesn't have to stay in there forever, but it provides the opportunity for an anchor point in order for you to expand later. So if you start increasing, I don't know, like Jack Rabbit, for example, which I still need to add to this cube.
Fantastic.
FYI. But now your bunnies could fly.
Yes.
You see where this is at, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I already thought about that. I just have to pick up a Jack Rabbit. And now that was a card that I was in direct opposition to adding additional tokens to the cube, especially rabbits. You mind pulling up Jack Rabbit real quick and tell them what it does?
All right. So Jacked Rabbit. So this is X1 and a white for a creature rabbit warrior. It has Ravenous, which is it enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. If it's 5 or more in the X, you draw a card when it enters. And whenever Jack Rabbit attacks, create a number of 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens equal to Jacked Rabbit's power. So obviously, if you think about combining this with Toby Beastie Befriender, so you're guaranteed 1 token from Toby. You only need to put 3 in the X for Jack Rabbit, so it's 5 mana, which is not it's not a small investment, right? You're doing a lot, but you are talking about a considerable amount of power that you got. It's pretty kind of aggro-y combo-y, know, in a way.
You've created a strange, like, I guess, like I said, a lynch point to signal something in the future. I'm okay with having cards that have open ends, right? Sometimes maybe you look at my cube and you say, well, I do in fact have a certain amount of tokens, but maybe there's just not enough to support this idea for the grand finale here. But this does linchpin the idea of, well, if you combine it with something like Jackrabbit, which happens to be the same color, it's not really that difficult or that far off to imagine a deck that combines those two and suddenly you have flying rabbits. And that represents a problem for the player across the table.
It can. Whether or not, again, it all comes down, I think it does have to come down to power level, right? So you do have to consider where you're putting your mana investment into a card like this compared to other strategies, right? Because now you're talking about you have to have put Toby on the battlefield, which is 3 mana. You have to have spent 5 mana on Jackrabbit.
Well, let's go one step further. Let's go to Oscillate. What is it? The new Oscillate.
Oscillate Pride.
Yeah, let's go with that card
Absolutely.
instead.
Yeah. So again, now you're kind of expanding the requirements for that. You've also got this consideration. If you are putting these cards in because you want to build a token deck, how are you now managing the needs of the drafters, right? Or the combat between two potential drafters, one of whom might be going for this white X color tokens draft, right? Tokens deck versus someone who is going for the more traditional Boros aggro, right? I'm kind of tending to sway away from just the mono white aggro. Not that I think it's not a good deck. I kind of feel like you really are denying yourself nowadays if you're not splashing Boros. I think because Boros is now such an incredibly strong aggressive color pairing and has been for a while. But now you've got to balance that between those two drafters if you've got all the relevant cards, again, that aren't left in the box.
Well, let's linchpin to something. Let's kind of show something that happens very frequently in a powered vintage cube. It's the ins and the outs. And I'll give an example of the card Sun Titan that went in and out, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's talk about Jackrabbit for a second, or Oscillate Pride. But now suddenly let's take a card that's kind of fallen out of favor, at least not for me, but for our good friend Chris that we had this conversation recently, would be the card Opposition.
Yes.
Do you see where now something has changed?
I do. And look, I am an Opposition fan. We've drafted last Thursday. And I drafted basically, it was an opposition deck without opposition against Chris, our good friend Samich. And to be honest, I think even though this wasn't a vintage cube, obviously, because it's no opposition in there. It was drafting his cube. But I can see why he's never going to want to put opposition in his cubes ever again, because it was a miserable experience.
And so I'm going to take a different half of that.
So
you can see where
now we're opening up another conversation. So now we're back to the fun factor.
Yeah, there you go.
Do you really want opposition in your cube?
Like,
is that an archetype?
I still run it. And we didn't mean to tangentially go off on that, but the purpose of that conversation, that exercise, is showing how we just went from Toby to Jackrabbit. Jackrabbit went to Oscillate Pride, and now we've jumped over to Opposition. When you start putting in cards that have these open ends, they provide like this emergent cube design, but they don't have to happen with like some sort of immediacy, because Toby came out in Dustmore and Jackrabbit came out in Bloomburrow prior, right? And you wouldn't have seen these intricacies. Now you're starting to see these tie-ins where now you've got an aggro package that's mono white that's very much there. But you've also now got this control package that's coming back to life with a card that would have been considered kind of a, I guess, like I said, a dead card. Opposition's not a dead card for me because it costs 4 mana, but when you're increasing the efficiency of all these cards, it starts pushing cards back like that. Love it, like it, or leave it. But this is why sometimes I kind of vault some of these cards. I lock them.
Absolutely.
I don't let them move, and I keep it. I realize that going off on Opposition is very miserable experience.
Yes,
for one person, but
it was for him. I fully get it. Like that is not a fun play experience for your opponent where you're just okay, it's my upkeep. Yes, you're tapping all my lands down again. Thank you very much.
So let's kind of talk about another one too, since we've kind of pinned off of that idea, something that plays into that idea a little bit more. We've got some cards that kind of they're less impactful than they were at one time. And what's interesting, and I've changed my mindset on this. There used to be a point where a card kind of died and I put it either in the elephant graveyard of cards, it kind of disappeared, or I sold it, traded it, whatever I needed to do, or I moved it to another cube. But a card like Elish Norn, the Grand Cenobite, which I had in my cube up until approximately October or late November, or early November, that it just wasn't as impactful as it once was because it's in that off color that Reanimator didn't want. Well, Duskmourn provided me with a gift. And I think it's an interesting card that kind of ties into what we're saying. And it was the Overlord of the Mistmoors. You mind telling them what that does?
So, yeah, Overlord of the Mistmoors, 5 colorless and 2 white for an enchantment creature, Avatar Horror, 6/6. Whenever Overlord of the Mistmoors enters or attacks, you create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. Also has Impending 4. So this is 2 colorless and 2 white mana. So if you cast this spell for its impending cost, it enters with 4 time counters on it and isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. So essentially, you cast it as an enchantment. You still get the enters ability with the 2/1 white insect creature tokens, but you obviously can't attack with it because it's only an enchantment, not an enchantment creature. And then it becomes an enchantment creature when the last impending counter has come off it. So now you've got this ability for only 4 mana to get 2/2/1 flyers. You've also got the ability to either reanimate or maybe hardcast it at the top end. I really like cards like this that they're great in the mid-range or in the mid-game, and they're phenomenal later in the game as well. Because obviously paying 7 mana for a 6/6 and 2/2/1 flyers is pretty rock solid value.
So it's more impactful. It's more interesting.
Big
It's more dynamic. I mean, Elish Norn, and I think about this a lot as a curator. I realize Elish Norn Grand Cenobite is still a great card. Like if you're still running it, it's a fun card. It's a fun
is
card.
It though?
Well, it is.
Is it though? Is it a fun card?
I don't know if it's fun.
I don't think it's fun for anybody.
We're gonna go with though. Some of these newer cards are providing a little bit more dynamicism. They're allowing plays to be a little bit more unique, a little bit more memorable.
The reason why cards like Elish Norn have really completely fallen by the wayside, obviously, back in the day, one of the primo reanimate cards, it's great because your creatures get +2/+2. Okay, well, I ain't got any other creatures typically, or much of them, that I care about in a reanimate package, right? So that's okay. Creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. Okay, that's okay. But what if I'm not playing against the creature deck? So now that's not particularly relevant. So now I've got a 4/7 with Vigilance. It ain't got flying, it ain't got trample, and it can be blocked by 1/1 squirrels or rabbits or whatever else. So it's okay. The reason why Elish Norn isn't great anymore, and maybe it wasn't even that good to begin with, when you've got Gristlebrands and so on and so forth, is because there's so many better targets now. And I don't even want to necessarily say it's always just power creep, but it is just power creep. Torsten is much better. Archon is better. Obviously, Gristlebrand is also better. So you've got these cards that are just so independently, phenomenally powerful, even in a vacuum or without, because they're either getting you cards, or, drawing you cards, or look at the top 7 and put all the cards in here, or sack a creature, draw a card, lose life, all that kind of stuff. So this is why cards like Elish Norn that might be good in a pretty extreme vacuum aren't anymore, and why cards like Overlord of the Mistmoors represent such a better option, because like you said, you're not restricted to it just in the end game as a reanimate target. Even at the high CMC that it is, you can now cast it for the 4 impending, you get the 2/2/1 flyers. So it's just a better card all round. Let's talk about we're gonna pour one out right now. I think we should everybody get your drinks and just pour one out, because Anthony has removed FTK.
Yep.
Oh, Flametongue Kavu, you will be sadly missed. Your art is fantastic. Everything about this card is I've loved FTK. I've played this card many times.
And so,
but it's been power crept.
And so I did a little bit of placeholder here because I kind of knew what I was going to be doing. But the expectation from the crowdsourcing was you need to put Pyrogoyf in there, and I did not. And when you look at my blog, you'll see a different card in there. In this case, it'll be Reckless Pyrosurfer. And I only did it because I knew what I was going to do in the future site here. And that Reckless Pyrosurfer was part of my aggro package that also ties into my lands matters. I had a method to my madness. But the card that I chose to put in over, say, Pyrogoyf was in fact Overlord of the Boiler Bilges. I just think this card is more interesting than the Goyfs, and I wanted to have an identity that was unique from Chris's Cube, right? Even at 540, which I'm sure he'll add this card at some point. But Overlord of the Boiler Bilges for 4 colorless and red, you get a 5/5. Enchantment creature, Avatar Horror. It's got the impending 4 that we talked about before. For 2 colorless and 2 red, you get impending. So it has like a reverse type of suspend, if you will, right?
Sure, yeah.
And then whenever Overlord of the Boiler Bilges enters or attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target. I think this is a really interesting card that kind of does what FTK does, probably does a little less sometimes than what Pyroglyph does, but it was a little bit more of my flavor point that I wanted because it hits the Reanimator, it hits the mono red, it does a lot of things.
You don't get your 4-2 though for 4. I mean, come on now, that 4-2 is relevant. I'm still gonna make the case for FTK. I'm an FTK fan, but you get it though, don't you? Because this is just, it's a better card.
And then what the card that I actually cut out of that, because we're sequencing a little different off the blog here, but it'd be a card like Arc Lightning. I've kind of started reevaluating my direct damage package. I want direct damage to be relevant, but what I ultimately decided is that I want my creatures to kind of be the aggro package, and that the lightning strikes and the incinerates and the bolts and all that will still exist. But when we start getting these ones that cost 3 that are a sorcery speed, I wanted to tone it back a little bit. It felt like I'd rather do 4 damage to the face, or to any target in that case, versus Arc Lightning with a dispersion.
I'm a little sad for Arc Lightning, and the reason is very simple. I've loved Arc Lightning every time I've been able to cast it against a green player and been able to take out 3 of their mana dorks when they're really hoping to be able to cast that 6 or 7 or 8 mana bomb. And you just say, no, I don't think you will. You can say goodbye to that birds. You can say goodbye to that noble hierarch. You can say goodbye to that elf. And I just 3-for-1 someone. But
I'm a huge fan of Arc Lightning personally.
I think Arc Lightning is great.
I think it's great. It's just neat. Cuts are hard, right? When I'm trying to increase, going back to what Sam did, where he did some hyper geometric math and he started running through and he was telling me the probability of me getting an aggro card, even a 2-1 for 1 was very slight, because of the dispersion of the 540 cube, not even going into the draft.
Oh, yeah.
And because I was cutting them, because aggro cards, simple little ones like that, will just say like your Jackal Pup style card, Savannah Lions. And you can put any kind of flavor text you want on that and make it better. But those cards are sometimes the easiest cards to cut when you're curating. And they almost too easy, and they come at a cost that you don't realize is happening, because you're like, oh man, I could cut this version of this Ragavan, some lesser version of it, and put in this Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, because I'd much rather have that. That does so much more, but you realize you're murdering your curve,
yes.
Right? And players want to have a nice little clean curve, and in addition to, you're also harming your aggro. In the case of a vintage cube where you need checks and balances, and it does provide that ballast point to make sure the other decks are not out of control. The police, you did say police.
Well, yeah, and okay, so typically, again, so we'll go all the way back to the original conversation where it was how do you balance, or where do you put a sort of set your aggro package. So let's talk about if you've got a cube where in theory you want your combo decks to operate around turn 4, right? Be able to present a win fairly consistently on turn 4. You want your mid-range packages to be able to really have gained a fairly insurmountable, advantage around that similar time, 4 or 5, whatever the case may be. So what do you need your aggro package to be able to do? Do you need it to win by turn 4, turn 5? Just get to the point where they've flooded the board so much that it's going to be almost impossible to stop them, given anything outside of, a board sweeper? Where do you sort of align that, right? Because in the vintage cube, you could win on turn 1. You could win on turn 1. You could actually win on turn 1, let alone just an insurmountable advantage. You can win that quickly. Your aggro package can't win that quickly. It can't win on turn 1.
But it still needs to exist. It needs to exist not just because
I don't disagree.
It just not because it can't win. It's because some players just like that. We actually had a little debate on our Discord. Did you see that this week? You and Sam were going at it.
We did.
And you guys were talking about, you're getting all theoretical. You were using $10 words. And I said, and the conversation was so big and so bloated. And you guys were on your podiums and
it started with such a tongue-in-cheek. Like I said, aggro, good, pick one, which is not obviously fair. And I kind of need to get off that because it was just meant to be a bit of a joke. Sam is obviously a passionate cube guy, passionate magic guy. He obviously enjoys aggro in general, right? So you can tell that this is something that he cares passionately about. So this is what kind of ignited the discussion. But I think aggro, I don't know, is it misunderstood? Does it have a role that's maybe a little oversold or even undersold when it comes to cube curation? What do you want it to do? For me, and I was an aggro player at heart back in the old 60 card days, right? And I would agree with Sam. He said, we made the point, you've got to make sure that, you're really understanding and appreciating that aggro is not just a turn creature sideways deck for people who've never played Magic before to
that
play.
was
Right?
what you guys were saying. It wasn't noob friendly, and I think the ultimate discussion boiled down to mid range was more noob friendly.
I disagree completely, and the reason why I disagree is because mid range typically doesn't just rely on creatures. If you take your old school, like a modern Jund, which is maybe the poster child of mid range, you're not just operating with putting creatures down and turning them sideways, right? You're dealing with playing your creatures and having sorcery speed interaction, instant speed interaction, using the stack, using planeswalkers. So now you've got all these different layers of even just a turn that can be quite complex for a new player. So I would disagree very, very much that mid-range is kind of the entry point. I would go back all the way to when I was playing those green decks in Modern with my Experiment ones and Colonian Tuskers and all that fun stuff. Yes, that presented its challenges at times when I'm navigating against Tron or against Grixis Death Shadow or against a control deck or against Twin and Pod when those decks were popular and legal back then. But still, ultimately, what I was trying to do was play creatures undercasted and turn them sideways and win the game. And I think that when you really reduce it down to the absolute most basic form is the most simplest way to win at Magic. I think if you ignore all the other synergies and all that kind of stuff that you can bring up, and I just think from the construction of Magic as a game, the structure, the complexities of it, that is the simplest way to win.
So, one more aggro card, and then we're going to kind of tie that one off. This was another one that just got printed.
Yes.
I'm looking for these neat cards that can help me fill that void so they're not so boring like just a Savannah Lions or a Jackal Pup, right? That's kind of outside the realm. We continue to get these hyper-pushed cards. Would you mind reading Kellen the Planar Trailblazer?
Yep, Kellen Planar Trailblazer. 1 red for another 2/1 legendary creature. No, it's not Ragavan. It's a human fairy scout. You can pay 1 and a red. If Kellen is a scout, it becomes a human fairy detective and gains whenever Kellen deals combat damage to a player. Exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Pretty strong. But it also has pay 2 and a red. If Kellen is a detective, it becomes a 3/2 human fairy rogue and gains double strike.
Yep.
Woo!
It's a neat little mana sink. I mean, it basically, ultimately, you can treat this as a Savannah Lions in red, right? A Jackal Pup. But you have an opportunity now when you're flooded and you want more gas, you can invest in this. Because there's a point where every aggro player gets frustrated. There's a point where they can't get around that Colonial Tusker just gets right in the way.
Exactly.
And they have to find a way around it. This provides that opportunity. It provides that out, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's by itself, it's single pressure. It's turn 1 pressure. It's not Ragavan, you're right. But it's a nice little side grade kind of card, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're not getting a treasure out of it. You're not exiling your opponent's cards.
It's hard to beat that right now.
It is, but you can't also make Ragavan a 3/2 with double strike. So they obviously fill a similar-ish role in the fact that they are 1-drop reds for an aggressive strategy that is going to be very happy to only get, or to get a 3/2 double striker for only 1 card outside of just the mana investment. But I think these cards, they're very, very good aggro cards. They represent a threat from the early and the mid game. I like it. I like it as an inclusion for your cube.
So let's kind of do a little bit more bouncing around here. We're just going all about the blog here. That's what we're doing.
All over the show.
And we're going to talk about it. And I recently added a new card that I want to kind of talk about with Stu that I think is interesting. I think when I spoke to Chris about it, he was medium on it, but I think there's a lot. I think this card, if it comes down, it's busted as AF. And it's going to be Koma the World Eater. And as I read this casting cost,
it gets more absurd the more you look at it, doesn't it?
This card is insane, but the casting cost is not something that you hope to ever pay. For 3 colorless and green, and blue. So
make pips great again.
Yeah,
I love it.
Buckle up. You get a legendary creature, Serpent, for an 8/12. This spell can't be countered, and I think that's fair. It's probably the most fair thing on here because you spent, I don't know, your entire checkbook and savings account trying to actually cast this thing. So, yeah, maybe it should stick. And then Trample, Ward 4, and then whenever Koma deals combat damage to a player, create 4 3/3, I have to get these tokens, Blue Serpent creature tokens named Koma's Coil. This card's nuts. Actually, when I was looking at it, I was thinking like, oh, cool. I would even show and tell this card if I had to. Like if it was my worst case scenario, I'd have no problem with that. I'd sneak attack this card in. I would do lots of silly stuff with this card.
Oh my
I would
gosh,
natural order this card, reanimate
attack.
this card.
Yes, all of the above. Like, look, the fact that you're sneak attack. Look, regardless of other options for sneak attack, sure, there's other good options for that. But the fact that you can put this 8/12 that's incredibly difficult to get off the board with Ward 4, and the fact that if it deals combat damage to a player, you get 4 3/3s. You're getting 12 power and toughness when it deals combat damage to a player. I mean, that's bonkers.
Yeah,
I am about this card. I love it.
I think it's really fun. I think it's a great little addition to the Power Cube. I also recently kind of caved in, and I may have, if you guys remember, there was this whole episode we did about Anthony didn't know about the initiative. It was Anthony learns about the initiative, right? Well, Anthony's now learned about initiative, and Anthony's now learned that he strongly dislikes what the game warping effects of the initiative are. I have cut it in its entirety. I do not like it. I didn't like...
You're not alone.
It messed up the fun. Whenever people tell you you're supposed to power max, right? That like pedal to the metal that a powered vintage cube can sometimes draw out of people, always pushing. And it did actually give, for a little bit of time, the opportunity for Boros to be back to what you talked about. How do you get these 2/1s to get in there and actually threaten everything else? Well, you do that with the initiative. When you put in stuff like, I don't know, we'll say, for example, White Plume Adventurer. They got what, banned in Legacy?
Yes.
Right.
It's one of the 60 card old formats like Legacy or Vintage. Yeah, because you're getting a 3/3 for 3, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. You untap all of them if you've completed the dungeon, and obviously it gives you the initiative when it enters. So, look, I am a proponent for the initiative as a power level include in any vintage cube. I'm never going to argue that it's not powerful enough, but I will certainly agree with anyone that says I don't want to include it because I don't find it fun. We've already kind of had conversations about these mini games, sub games that you play when you're playing a vintage cube. Monarch, obviously, kind of the poster child for that mini game,
right?
And I think Initiative is kind of Monarch. Maybe not.
It's better than Monarch. It's so warping. It's so degenerate.
Look, I don't know if I agree that it's as good. Man, Monarch is so good. It's a guarantee. It's a card every turn. It's a card.
Yeah, but it creates.
I'd rather
it creates
have cards than the little
Monarchy creates a push and pull, and I know you could argue that the initiative does.
I think it does.
But once it's online and it starts doing the thing and starts repeating, initiative starts kind of creating, like Chris said this best. It warps the entire strategy around that singular card that's now woken that up.
It does.
You have to stop everything you're doing to get that. If you don't get that, you're going to die, which would seem okay. And for those that are running it, rock on. But it just kind of really absorbed all the fun. I removed from the cube Caves of Chaos Adventurer, Feywild Caretaker, which I thought was a kind of a fun card. We're going to say air quotes fairly costed, but it kind of just played in this from the Catacombs, which was a card I almost thought about going hybrid on this, but it was so warping. I just didn't feel like I needed it. Undermountain Adventurer, I cut that. White Plume Adventurer, and Seasoned Dungeoneer. The ones that actually created this real problem out of all of it was actually White Plume, Seasoned Dungeoneer, and then I'm going to go ahead and say Caves of Chaos Adventurer. Those are the real offenders. But
I would. All right, I'll say I agree. Caves of Chaos Adventurer, it's in red and you get trample, so it's very difficult to stop someone getting the initiative. I don't know if I necessarily even agree with what I'm about to say, but I almost feel like I even want to say that it might have been a little better, more fun, ? If when all creatures with initiative are off the battlefield, like the door to the dungeon closes. Something like that, right? So now dungeons are gone, no longer available, can't traverse through them, job done. So maybe you have to play another initiative card.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. The fact that they kept cycling is what makes them...
Exactly. You complete a dungeon and you can just do it all over again. You can just go back into the dungeon. So I think that's where... and I don't know how many times, how long is a game going to last where you're going to cycle through a dungeon multiple times? maybe never. I don't know if I'd seen maybe a second dungeon had come up, right? But for the most part, the games are over even before.
Typically, I'm dead by the
starts.
time I get the lightning axe tossed at me.
Yeah,
Right?
Deal 5 damage. I mean, that's
I'm pretty much out of the game here, and so I had to make some decisions. So in the case of Caves of Chaos Adventure, I put in Noise Marine.
Love Noise Marine.
I think it's fun. It kind of does the FTK thing that I wanted. When I'm looking at these cards and I'm realizing I'm not running the Pyrogoyf, which I acknowledge is a very powerful card, and I already knew I wanted to do the Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, but I thought Noise Marine kind of played that role also, and that if I put these two cards in here, that the players wouldn't really notice that. I enjoy these type of cards. In the case of Feywild Caretaker, I put in a card that I've been staring at for a long time that I felt like needed to be in here with Spell Pierce. And I realize these cards are interchangeable. You can swap them out. They're kind of like utilitarian to a degree. They don't matter as much as you want them to, but I think this is a fine, just something that Control likes.
I can't disagree with Spell Pierce. It's 1 mana, counter target non-creature spell unless its controller plays 2. That's it. It's simple, elegant, can be impactful at any stage of the game, really. So I don't dislike it at all. And again, I think removing the entire initiative mechanic and just putting in cards that you don't have to put in a bunch of synergistic cards. You can just put in a bunch of cards that you feel should be in there because you like how they look in your cube. Who can argue with that? I think that's great.
And then the case of From the Catacombs, only because I didn't want to misrepresent the idea that when people are drafting, and again, it's in our friend circle, but there is other things that we take our cube to, and I didn't want to say the initiative, I didn't want to leave like remnants of the initiative in there. That was something I thought about for a long time. Could I leave like 3 or 4 of them there? I knew it would then draw the questions, well, where's your White Plume Adventurer? Where's all these really good versions? I didn't want to play like the side versions of initiative. That was the crux of all this, right?
I agree.
So I just said, I'm just going to, it's not that I won't ever put it back in because, with a lot of cards, we'll talk about Jace the Mind Sculptor as a tangential conversation. It was the threat, and Liliana Vale was the threat. Even Oko was the threat. But as these cards continue to get better and better, these cards kind of step to the side a little bit.
All right, well,
there may be a day.
I'm still thinking of taking Oko, pick one, pack one. Like, I still think Oko.
But there may be a day.
Jace, on the other hand, has definitely his day to be, the absolute, oh my gosh, unless Black Lotus or Ancestral Recall or something is in the pack, then I'm probably going to take Jace. Like, those days are long behind us. But I wouldn't argue about putting Jace the Mind Sculptor in your Vintage Cube nowadays. I still think it's a good card. Has it had its day?
I still
maybe,
run it.
But
well, that's what happens at 540.
I think it's got to be in there, right?
Sure, it's still in there, but there's like a pecking order that does happen. It's kind of a first in, last out type of thing, right? That's what I kind of follow. So these cards do slowly kind of just fall off over time. People don't even notice it, but I didn't feel like I could keep like a quarter of a package of the initiative, etc. So just cut it all. So I put in From the Catacombs, I put in Unearth. This is a card that I actually wanted in there for a long time. At this point, it's interesting where had I put Unearth into this cube, say 5 years ago, I would have gotten scoffed at. But now because cards are so low to the ground and it can fit like a Mardu aggressive package.
You better be sure that I am very happy to see Unearth if I've got like a Lurrus deck that I'm brewing.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's exactly what I'm saying. It kind of makes that a little
bit
bit more balanced, right?
Yeah.
It's not the perfect card, but it does what it wants, And then I've got Undermountain Adventure. I brought a card back as a placeholder for now over Undermountain Adventure. I put Fauna Shaman back in here. This card is kind of a okay, dirtily version of Natural Order, right?
No, because it goes into your hand instead of on the battlefield.
Yeah,
so I don't. I'm not a fan of Fauna Shaman. I completely agree. You want to get rid of the initiative. You don't want any remnants, be it Undermountain Adventure in green or anything else. I just don't know if I want to spend 2 mana and then another mana to discard. It has to be a creature, and I have to go and get another creature card. It's not awful, but I don't find
I'm going to call it.
interesting.
I'm going to call it a placeholder. I do that a lot. So whenever I want to cut something out and I've got something in my binders, I place a placeholder.
You know what this means? Tonight, it's going to be your birthday, and we're going to go and hang out with the family.
And we're going to go hide.
And we're going to go hide, and we're going to be talking about Fauna Shaman, and my wife is going to be like, can you please help me with the kids? And I'm going to be like, no, I'm talking about Fauna Shaman. Sorry.
And then in regards to White Plume Adventurer,
love this change.
I finally broke down and put a Johnny Necrol Pariah in there. I'm still not in love with this card, but it does meet my aggro requirements that I was looking for.
I mean, I think it's an
card.
absolute shoe-in.
It's a good card. I'm just not like blown away with it. I'm just not.
It's pretty good.
I know it's good.
It's really
It doesn't bring me joy. I can't help that. I mean, it's got nothing to do with the fact the card's good or not, because the card's obviously good. I just don't find it. It's like, whatever, cool. Yeah. It's just not as interesting as I'd want it to be, but, I get it. We're going to move on. I put it in there. I caved in a little bit.
We could spend the whole of the rest of this episode, which is already almost an hour long, talking about this card.
I know, but we played this card a lot, again, and nobody noticed that it wasn't there. That's my point. The question never came up, are you running a Johnny Necrotal Parade, and why not? That never happened. It doesn't have that kind of, I guess, that latchkey kind of idea that Jace the Mind Sculptor once had, right? If I said a Power Vintage Cube, you're going to, you got the Power 9 in here. It's just assumed, right? Nobody ever asked me if I have this card in here. No one cares. It's if it didn't show up in your draft, you would assume it's over in the missing cards in the box. That's what's so interesting about what I can do with 540. I can be sneaky.
All right, fair enough. But I still think it should be in there.
It is in there.
I know, and I think it should be.
But it's like, whatever. The problem is caving into all of these like new tech cards is 6 months from now, another tech card will come out and everybody said, this should be in there. You need to get that in there. It's funny. My little brother Josh, love him to death. We played Commander all the time, and I'd build a Commander deck, and I'd kind of try not to min-max it too much at the time. We did eventually. We went full Arsenal, went nuclear with Commander, but there was a period where we don't min-max, and Josh would always call me and go, "Hey, you should add this card, and you should add this card." I go, "Josh, dude, I can only put 100 cards in this deck by the legality of Commander." He goes, "Well, you should add this card, and you should add this card." I go, Josh, what are you going to cut for? I don't know, just add it. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, you can see where the problem is.
I do. And look, when we had those discussions, I would legitimately give you cuts, and I would try and give you options, right? I think this attitude, I would always have this counterpoint that I would have with and this isn't just a Magic thing, right? You can do this with sports. You can do this with any activity where you've got this kind of switcheroo, like, oh, I want to get rid of this player from my soccer team or my hockey team. Like, oh, okay, who do you replace them with? And if they can't come up with a valid response, right, and especially with sports, that person's got to be available. Well, it's different with Magic because you can just go on TCG Player or go to your local game store and be like, hey, I want that card, please. I'm going to put it in my power queue. But, okay. You don't know that Ajani is a 1/2 that creates a 2/1 and it's 2 mana.
Yes.
Okay. So if you're able to kill that token very, very quickly, which is not difficult, all right? Skull Clamp, let's say, for an example. And now you get a Planeswalker. So you get to tick up a Planeswalker that enters with 3 loyalty, up to 5 loyalty. And then the next turn, you get to, for -4, each opponent chooses an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, a planeswalker from among the non-land permanents they control, and then sacrifices the rest.
It's not bad.
It's not bad.
It's kind of like Jace.
It's not bad at all.
It's kind of. It has that same vibe of like Jace. Was it Jace? Little baby Jace. Jace Riven's Prodigy.
Jace Riven's Prodigy.
It feels like that.
I don't really care about that, and that is a powerful ability by itself. What is also really nice is it has a 0 to create a 2/1 white warrior creature token. And when you do, if you control a red permanent other than Ajani Nakatal Avenger, which is the Planeswalker side, he deals damage to the number of creatures you control to any target.
Yep.
So now you've got this like ping, 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 ping ability and a Planeswalker.
It's there. I added it.
We've been talking about Ajani's abilities for about what seems like 6 months now. I don't know how much of this is going to stay in the episode. Hopefully, all of it.
I'll leave all of it. It's still kind of boring to me.
It's the holidays. People are traveling, right?
They're driving. They need something to listen to
on the road. Yeah.
And then the last one, Seasoned Dungeoneer. I've got a placeholder on here too. A Seasoned Dungeoneer's gone, and then I put in Dauntless Bodyguard. Not an overly exciting card. It's what I had in my binders. This is going to be a sweet Oscillate Pride coming soon that I have to purchase off our friend Sam, so I know where I stand with this one. But yeah, that's kind of like how Anthony, learned about the initiative, then later basically killed the initiative. So yeah.
All right. Well, rip initiative. We'll leave it at that. If you're an initiative fan, or if you feel that initiative should be in your cube and you want to tell us why, then shoot us a tweet or a blue sky or an email or whatever. Let us know, or hit us up on the Discord. I'm not sad to see it go. I wouldn't complain if it came back, but it is what it is.
He did bring up an important point that UberCube is active on Blue Sky as well as we're gonna maintain Twitter and Blue Sky at the same time. I'm gonna continue to post to both of those, and I'm also gonna be in the not only the Cube subreddit for MTG, but I'm also gonna be in the traditional MTG. So but I'm doing all the social media, so it's good to point out.
I work from home, so I get to see a lot of the Reddit combos and the Discord combos. I'm not as active as I would like to be right now. It's the holidays and all the family stuff that's going on, but there is a lot of conversation right now. A lot of the conversation because we've got a lot of sets coming out and a lot of new things that are going on with Magic. A lot of cool conversation.
I think the takeaway here is just because the new things are coming out that you don't have to follow the status quo. I don't have to march to what everybody you don't have to march when you own a Power Vintage Cube to what the masses demand.
You don't have to do anything.
You can do what you want because it's your cube and you need to just basically keep it that way. That would be my advice to anyone listening. Don't feel like every time you see a Moto update, you need to purchase or do whatever you do to make new cards.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then other than that, this has been a fun episode. I hope everybody has a great holiday. I think we're encroaching the first bits of that here, at least in the U.S. portion. And, Stu, can you take us away to the socials, please?
All right, first of all, as always, a huge shout out to all of our Patreons. You guys are just getting too numerous to list at this point, so I'm just going to say, again, thank you so much from here over at UberCube, from myself, from Anthony, and from May, who is I'm sure, hanging out and having a good time right now. We really do appreciate all the ongoing support. It really does mean a lot to us. As always, if you want to get in on the conversation, you can go check out the MTGFB Facebook drafting page at facebook.com/groups/MTGCube. As always, if you enjoyed the show, we would really appreciate a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Really helps get us out there to the masses.
And we could use some help on the podcast as far as Spotify is going specifically. We've noticed that there's been a trend, and I would love to get some more 5 stars in there. It would be really helpful as far as getting the word out there. And if you're willing to do it, we would truly appreciate it. Some 5 stars on Spotify specifically.
All right. Thank you very much. As always, you can use our altersleeves.com/UberCube affiliate link. Get 5% off your purchase, as well as our inkedgaming.com/UberCube affiliate link. Go check them out for all kinds of custom and large volume products available for your cube or any other Magic experience.
The holidays are coming.
They are.
Gotta spend that money. Capitalism. Let's go.
Get your UberCube
non-recyclable mouse
mats, play sets. I don't know. You can find us at Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also reach us via email at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. As always, come hang out with us on the Discord. And again, for our patrons at patreon.com/UberCube, a huge thank you for helping us keep the lights on. And we hope in this holiday season to keep the episodes rolling. And to everyone, stay safe.
And as we always say here at UberCube, happy cubing!